I want to welcome back Timothy Walsh to continue our discussion on all things uranium. In part two, we're continuing our deep dive into the uranium demand dynamic because there's so many reasons why uranium demand will skyrocket that you just can't fit them all into one podcast. And there's no one better to speak on uranium fundamentals than Timothy Walsh. So welcome back, Timothy.
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I really enjoyed the last interview. So thanks for that.
Thank you. And just to dive right in, is there anything you wanted to maybe build on or clarify from part one?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, that was my first podcast. So I did make a few little errors, and Twitter has informed me that there are a few things I didn't get right. So just to clarify a few points, and I'd really like to thank Mike Young from Vimy Resources for answering this question for me. So in the last episode, we said that a reactor would use, on average, 27 tons per year of uranium. So a 1,000 megawatt reactor, which is fairly typical, would use 27 tons. Well, that figure is actually enriched uranium. It's not the actual uranium ore from the mine. So Mike Young estimates that you would actually need 200 tons of uranium ore from the mine. And then it goes through the different fuel stages. So when it gets mined, that's just the pure uranium ore, which is U3O8. That then gets converted to yellowcake. And that then goes to UF6 and then into fuel rods. So that's like a 18-month to 24-month process, so about 2 years. So that actually improves the demand scenario, Elliot. So it's not 27 tons, it's uranium ore, it's 200 tons. So the second point of clarification, Elliot, is I talked about California, how they've implemented massive solar power plants over the past decade. And they actually have, at many points in the year, an excess supply of power. And I think I said they sell electricity to other states. They do that, but often they have to pay other states to take the power off their hands. So California is not the only one. So you have Texas, they have a lot of wind, the UK, a lot of wind, and also Germany. So in these situations, they have to offload their excess power. So they pay other states to take their power. Otherwise, their electricity lines overload and the transformers start to trip out, and that's when you get blackouts. So that's a very interesting point that investors should be aware of about the limitations of solar and wind.
Well, I guess they have no way of truly effectively storing this renewable energy. So it's just it's lost and it causes these issues, right? And that's kind of what you're saying about renewables, is that they're not really sustainable to power large areas, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's always that hope of battery storage. And, as we talked about, it's a very promising technology. But in terms of wind and solar being a baseload power source, it's just unrealistic to have battery storage for the whole of the US. I mean, that's never going to happen. But wind and solar, they're definitely complementary to the baseload power sources, and it will keep growing, no doubt. But yeah, too much sun, that's a bad thing. Not enough sun, that's also a bad thing.
Yeah, and I watched this thing this week about how, like, if you could cover the whole Sahara Desert in solar panels and get enough energy to power the earth, but transporting it, you'd lose like so much of the energy that it's just kind of pointless, because the further you transfer it away, the more you lose. So
But it's also, think of the land use of these solar panels, and is that a world you want to live in, where a natural environment is covered with wind farms and covered with solar panels? So it's kind of ironic that you're trying to protect the environment, but sometimes you can actually destroy that environment by putting up these massive solar farms and wind turbines.
it's a great point, and that's why uranium's great, because it's so dense, right? And you can store it in a small area.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can have you can put a nuclear power plant, roughly 1,000 megawatts. You can put that on about 30 or 40 acres of land. If you want to get the same amount of power, you virtually times it by about 800 for solar panels. So the land usage is absolutely huge for solar and also wind. And it does interfere with the environment. I mean, if you look into it with birds flying into wind turbines, yeah, it's sort of opposite to what people think renewable energy actually is. So, Elliot, the third point of clarification is I talked about the first Chinese reactor being connected in 1994. So, not true. The first reactor, the Qinshan Phase 1 unit, was connected in 1991, but it wasn't in commercial operation until 1994. So, for that person on Twitter, there's your answer. It was 1991, but yeah, not in commercial operation until a few years later.
Cool. Well, you got 99.9% of the other pieces that you talked about right. So congratulations.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to be accurate, obviously, because you don't want investors getting the wrong idea. But yeah, fairly close to the mark anyway. So the missing part of last week, and this is why we've decided to do demand part 2, is there's a really big piece of the demand puzzle we failed to talk about, and that is life extensions. So when we talk about life extensions, what that means is we're extending the operating life of an existing nuclear reactor. Okay, so there are roughly 442 reactors currently operating, and 2/3 of those are actually over 30 years of age. So with these nuclear power plants, they often get issued a license for 40 years to operate. And often in the demand modeling, people are assuming that these reactors are being decommissioned at the 40-year mark. And that's when they come up with phrases like, nuclear is in decline. So I really want to address that. And it's a huge part of the demand puzzle. And it actually improves the demand outlook dramatically. It's something I kind of missed the first 12, 18 months. I was purely looking at the reactor builds in China and, I was looking at uranium supply and reactor builds. But there's a huge other factor, like a big bear sitting in the room, which I think Mike Alkin has talked about a lot, and Brandon Munro. They've talked about this a lot, other commentators in the uranium industry. The fact is, once a reactor is approaching that 40-year mark, that's their license to operate. Governments and policymakers have some really difficult questions to answer. So the first question, Elliot, is what will actually replace that baseload power capacity of that reactor? So in other words, what power source will fill that void? Because as you know, nuclear is such a fantastic source of baseload power. It operates day and night. The only part of the cycle where nuclear reactors aren't in operation is during that refueling phase. So every 18 months to 2 years, they refuel, and the reactors would be offline for about a month.
I can see how recommissioning or extending the life of these nuclear reactors would kind of make sense unless you want to lose all that power generation.
Yeah. It's like how do you replace that baseload source? So you're putting pressure on the energy grid. So something else has to replace that source of power. And that's very difficult for governments. Do you go to gas? Do you go to coal? It's a very difficult question to answer. But the second one, Elliot, which we would all know about, is how will the closure of this reactor affect the emission targets of that state, of that country? Now, that is a really, really big question. So just remember, the USA produces about 20% nuclear. That's roughly, it's probably a bit less, maybe 19% of their energy is produced by nuclear. but 55% of their carbon-free electricity comes from nuclear. So that's a huge figure, and it's the number one source of carbon-free electricity in the US. So nuclear really is lifting the load in terms of the US meeting their emissions targets. So again, we talked about this last episode. How do you replace a carbon-free reactor? What do you do?
It's a great question. And to me, it seems like all roads are going to lead to politicians making the decision to keep them going at all costs, right? Because they have no other options, it seems like, especially with the green energy movement.
Yeah, it's as soon as you start taking these reactors offline, something else has to replace it in terms of the baseload power, but also how do you keep your emissions targets in check? So, I mean, the USA, 20% nuclear, and it's 55% of their carbon-free energy. If you look worldwide, Elliot, nuclear is 10% of the energy mix, but it's a whopping 29% of carbon-free power. So the number one source is hydro, but a close second is nuclear. So this is what governments and policymakers, once the date kind of creeps up to 40 years, what's happening now is they're going through life extensions of these reactors. So the process basically is a utility would apply for a second 20-year operating license. So that's just a matter of, going through the different safety procedures. The regulators would come in and do an initial safety review of the plant. They would probably have to replace different components that have aged. So it's not cheap, it's not free, but it's a lot cheaper than actually building a brand new reactor. So of the 96 US reactors in operation, 88 of them have received approval to run another 20 years. So that's a massive figure, Elliot. And the main message I'm trying to get across is a reactor staying online is just as good as a new build coming online.
Right. And it seems like the logical thing to do is to extend the life of every single nuclear plant, unless there's some other special circumstance. And if that happens, which people should expect, then that would increase the demand, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's again, I've looked at the demand modeling, and basically opponents of nuclear, they talk about the aging US reactors. So the aging reactors in North America and Europe. And it's true, they are quite old, the reactors, and they're coming up to those 40-year mark. But what they're not factoring in is you can virtually double the life of these reactors. So that's just as good as a new build. And in terms of the demand profile, we already talked about all these new reactors coming online from China and in these emerging economies. If you've got that, all these new builds happening, if you combine that with the life extensions, so virtually the rate of closures dramatically slows when you extend the life of a reactor from 40 to 60 to 80 years. So if you can slow that rate, the demand for uranium even, it skyrockets even further.
I can see that. And, just more of them running, more of them burning uranium. And now, so when they do extend the life of these plants, will the capacity increase?
Look, probably not. I think you can make small improvements in terms of the fuel burn. So, you could improve capacity by 5 or 10%. But I think roughly the fuel load would be similar. And something else to talk about, Elliot, is the reactors that do retire. So in any given year, you've got reactors that come online, then you've got reactors that retire. What the trend is, and we touched on this last episode, is that the older reactors, their megawatt capacity is much lower than the new reactors coming online. So I think we talked about China when they first started their nuclear builds. They were well and truly under 1,000 megawatts. There was a lot of reactors, 600, 700, 800 megawatts. Now it's not uncommon to have 1,200, 1,500 megawatts. So in some instances, reactors have doubled in size. So if you're an older reactor, you're more likely to, probably be 1,000 megawatts and under. If you're a new reactor coming online, the chances are you're probably 1,000 plus megawatts. So that's something investors should really think about. So when you're trying to calculate this demand, you shouldn't just look at reactors. So you might see a headline, Elliot, for example, 7 reactors come online, but 10 close down. The nuclear industry is in decline. So that's a typical headline you might see in the mainstream media. But what you have to do is you've got to calculate the demand based on the megawatts, not the actual reactors.
The net increase to the megawatts will go up if 7 close and 7 open, right? Because the new ones are more
Yeah.
powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just a simple example. So just say a 800 megawatt reactor closes down or is decommissioned, and then a 1,200 megawatt reactor comes online. It's not one for one. You're actually plus 400 megawatts, if that makes sense. And that happens in reverse too. So if a 1,200 megawatt reactor was decommissioned and the 800 megawatt reactor came online, you would be negative 400 megawatts. So all the guys who do this demand modeling, so if you look at Mike Alkin, if you look at Brandon Munro from Bannerman Resources, they do all their own demand modeling. And both have said they look at the megawatts, not the actual reactors. So that's a more accurate way of calculating whether this is actually a growth business.
Okay, and that makes sense. And I'm assuming the models point to growth. If you also factor in the fact that there will be less closures in the future because the life extensions will increase.
Yeah, exactly. And, these guys, so Mike and Brandon, they factored in life extensions as well. And they've looked at each jurisdiction and they've done their own calculations and the likelihood of whether countries would extend these reactors beyond their license. And that's due to politics and all that type of thing. But in their models, they say that nuclear is a growth business, and they come up with between 1% to 3% per year growth business. And they rightly point out that's not a sexy number. 1% to 3%, it doesn't seem like much, but they're basing these figures on very conservative numbers, so they're not overshooting here. And I think if you look down into the pipeline 10 years down, as China keeps bringing reactors online, I think that growth figure will go up. So it could go to 5 or 6%. So if you couple that growth, that demand growth, with a big gaping hole in the form of a supply deficit, as we said last week, the stars are aligned for a massive upshoot in the uranium spot price.
Totally. And that 1% to 3% number isn't China, right? Because I think we talked about before how they're about to double their output in 10 years or so.
Yeah, this is just global growth, Elliot. So I mean, China's growth rate is quite extraordinary.
You also said China alone will eat up essentially all the uranium that they will be able to eat up all the uranium produced in 2020. So
yes, sorry, by 2040, they will consume all of the current supply of uranium. The produced supply of uranium. So yeah, that's the global growth, 1% to 3%. That's what Mike and Brandon have estimated. And they really do their figures like they've got these massive spreadsheets and they've spent years working on this. So yeah, the life extensions, it's a really interesting point And the key message is a reactor staying online is just as good as a new build. So if a reactor goes from 40 years to 80 years, you've got demand, which is staying online. So that's terrific for us as investors.
Yeah, and I think over time the demand models will forecast less closures, more life extensions, and therefore a higher growth rate of capacity.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, yeah, pretty much all the US reactors, which are, getting pretty old now. So just consider a reactor built in the 80s. By 2020, it's coming up to that 40-year mark. And yeah, virtually all these reactors will get that 20-year operating license to 60 years. And there's a reactor that's actually in the 80-year club. So the reactor at Turkey Point in Florida, so units 3 and 4, they have approval for 80 years of operation. So yeah, these things can last a very long time. I mean, 80 years is huge, and you've got that initial capital outlay, and it is expensive. There's no way of getting around it. You will spend billions of dollars building a new reactor, but if you've got it for 80 years instead of 40 years, you're basically lowering the cost per kilowatt hour, and that makes it more competitive with other sources like gas, solar, and wind.
Yeah, and I also wonder if the current demand models are factoring in just a radical shift away from fossil fuels because, right, I mean, it depends on kind of who's in power, what the politics are, but if you have in America Democrats in all three houses, then yeah, I would they just today eliminated all fossil fuel production off of federal lands and they shut down the Keystone
Mm,
pipeline. So I just
mm.
think all these factors would probably increase the nuclear demand over time, right?
Well, absolutely. And China, they classify nuclear as a renewable source of energy. So that's how they classify it. We in the West, we're getting close to saying nuclear is renewable. You still have that waste, but it is stored safely, and that's another misconception by the general public is there's this existential threat of nuclear waste that somehow it'll come into contact with humans, either in the water supply or you picture the Simpsons, Elliot, where you've got these drums of green glowing liquid. It's leaking out of the barrels and just flowing into the local water supply, and you have three-eyed fish. That's the perception people have, but I'll have to put up a few photos on Twitter of where this nuclear waste is stored. And yeah, it's professionally stored, it's contained. The amount of safety measures in place is just well and truly beyond any other waste from any other power source. So yeah, I'll have to put some photos online, but even there's you look at calls to bury nuclear waste a few hundred meters underground in the desert, and I often think, is that really necessary? It's mainly, I mean, the calls for that, it's mainly a political call and to try to put the public at ease. But someone like Michael Schellenberger, who you should look up, he's an advocate for nuclear power. He proposes that nuclear waste, the best and most efficient way of storing it is actually on site at the nuclear power plant. That's probably the safest place. And you don't have to go to all this effort and be digging tunnels 500 meters under the ground. I mean, you don't have to do that. And you can reduce the cost by just storing the waste on site.
That works. And at least we know that there are plenty of options like digging deep holes if we have to get rid of the nuclear wastes and make it safe. So an argument that says that nuclear waste is an existential threat doesn't hold water because there are alternatives, whether or not they're needed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, that's more of a perception thing, Elliot, but it is changing with the with the drive for each country, each state to go to zero emissions, people are really taking a second look at nuclear. It's definitely back in favour. People are talking about it. Even people who 10 years ago were anti-nuclear, they're sort of waking up and coming to the reality that you need nuclear. It needs to be a part of the solution. So if you shut down every nuclear plant, there is no way that as a globe we can reach our emissions targets. There is no way we can do it because, as we mentioned, it's 29% of the carbon-free electricity, power, I should say, actually comes from nuclear. So, yeah, that figure, you can't ignore that figure. You really can't. And yeah, in the West, policymakers and governments alike are slowly changing their view, which is a really good thing.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what, at least in America, the current regime is going to do about their green initiatives, right? Because they're building those right now, and it would have to include nuclear, you would think.
I think so. I really think so, Elliot. And, you'd probably know more about it. You're in the US. But, I mean, it really confuses me why there isn't nuclear in Australia. It really confuses me. We have a modern economy, and we're just happy to have gas and to have coal and wind farms and solar, and we just have not gone down the road of nuclear, mainly due to politics. It's just a politician. It's too hard for a politician. It's an uphill battle to front up to an election campaign and propose that we put in a reactor in this location. It's very tricky, and I really don't think there's really the political will in Australia right now. Hopefully that changes. But at the very least in the US, you have to keep those reactors online. So, get those extensions in place. They can run for 80 years. But I guess the next thing, Elliot, is the construction of the power plant in Georgia. Well, it was an absolute public relations nightmare. So basically, the US, for the first time in 30 years, so there was no nuclear reactor constructions, but in 2009, there was basically an extension of, there's a Georgia power plant called Vogtle. I think it's Vogtle nuclear plant. So they had the existing reactors, so units 1 and 2, and they were going to build units 3 and 4. So the construction started 2009, and the expected completion date was supposed to be 2016. And the cost was estimated to be about 14.3 billion. So, I mean, that's quite steep. That's a bit steep for 2 reactors, but, it's, you've got these reactors running for 80 years, so it's not a bad spend. Basically, what happened is there were a series of errors along the way during the build. There was some design flaws which they had to fix up, and it put them behind schedule. There was changing building contractors halfway through the build. Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy. It was just a series of errors along the way. So basically, instead of finishing in 2016, it's still being built. And the cost is blowing out to 27 billion. So imagine 14.3 billion, cost blowing out to 27 billion. And now the units won't be completed until 2021, 2022. So this was a real public relations nightmare for the US. So not being in the game for about 30 years, they then decide to get back in the game and do a build. And it's just, it's really blowing up in their face. And unfortunately for the nuclear industry, this is something which is commonly referenced by the anti-nuclear crowd about nuclear is too expensive. And they refer to this Georgia disaster, really. So it's really sad to see because, the US was a powerhouse in nuclear back in the 70s and the 80s. And, Westinghouse was the stock standard brand that built all these reactors. So for them to go virtually bankrupt during the build and to have all these cost blowouts and lawsuits, China and Russia must be looking at this thinking that the US is doesn't really have a seat at the nuclear table, and they are just a shadow of themselves. So it's a public relations disaster, and what it really says to people, and there is a perception that nuclear is way too expensive, and why not just go to natural gas? Why not go to solar and wind? It's so much cheaper. But what I would say, Elliot, is it's not necessarily that nuclear is too expensive. It's actually the jurisdiction where these reactors are being built. Because not many people reference China, South Korea, and Japan. They don't reference them because they build reactors on time, on budget. So China, on average, can build a reactor in about 5 years at a cost of 2.5 billion per reactor. Now, not many people reference this. They always bring up what happened in the US, in Georgia, and there's a few other instances in the West where you've had these huge cost blowouts, and that really tarnishes the industry. But if you actually go to the areas where nuclear is growing, and it's just going gangbusters in China, for example, they build it on time, on budget.
Yeah, yeah. And these are the things I have to say about that because living in the United States, the things I know are that the current political party that's in power isn't worried about spending money. They're not worried about printing money. The primary focus is green energy. Like day one, rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. And no one in this regime or in government at all is talking about like tapering money, worried about costs. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
think they're going to be worried about the cost. They're going to say, well, what costs more, like a climate crisis or nuclear, if that's what's needed for the green energy to replace fossil fuels. So just, living here, I don't see how the political will would be dampened at all for doing everything possible for the green initiative to take place.
I think so, mate. And look, it was one of those things where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. There were like lawsuits along the way, and just constant construction delays. And if you want to look at a timeline of what happened and what went wrong, there's a really good article. I think it's called Power Mag. And the headline is How the Vogtle Nuclear Expansion's Costs Escalated. So if you look that up, it takes you through the timeline. And yeah, so it's a bit of a PR disaster. And I think that kind of does give anti-nuclear groups, it definitely gives them ammunition, but they don't quote China, South Korea, Russia, Japan, because an example, just last year, 7th of September, China approved, this is an article in the paper, by the way, China approved $10 billion worth of funding for 4 new reactors. So each one of them was just roughly over 1,000 megawatts. So that clocks in at about 2.5 billion per reactor. So that they can obviously build these things on time, on budget. So it's mainly the jurisdiction. It's where you build these things. And if you've got a whole heap of red tape, and if you've got governments that come in during the build who are anti-nuclear, it can really mess up your timeline. So, for example, you hear of situations where halfway during the build, a new government comes in to power, and they make a law where you have to have extra safety standards at each reactor. So they apply these retrospectively. So midway through the build, they have to change their design, which is insanely expensive. That simply wouldn't happen in China. You've got the one government, so you don't have problems like that. And you also have something, it's a bit of a cynical view, Elliot, but I often think with these private construction companies in the US and in any Western country, in fact, that would they be deliberately stalling on these projects? Are they deliberately holding up construction just to drag out the costs? That's a little bit cynical, but it takes a lot longer to build reactors in the West compared to China.
Yeah, I can see that, but what I'm seeing most, I mean, if Trump was still in power, he loved talking about clean coal, if that made any
Mm.
sense. And he just loved pumping up the oil industries. He was all about it. I could totally see how nuclear would slip big time under him. But currently, I mean, the Paris Climate Accord, green energy is the most important thing, literally the most important agenda too. It seems like European politicians, American politicians, and you were talking about how there's one party in China. Well, it seems like in America, you have the media, you have the party, and you have big companies all aligned right now on the green energy initiative. So I would be bullish on the green energy initiative taking place in the West.
Yeah, exactly. And as we talked about last episode, this movement is not going anywhere. And if anything, it will just accelerate over time. So there is a real global push to get to zero emissions. How long that takes, that's anyone's guess, but that's the movement. And yeah, as we said, nuclear really answers a lot of those questions. How do we get to zero? And how do we account for this growing world population? How do we account for all these EVs coming onto the grid? So yeah, it's a very interesting time for nuclear, and just to see that the change in sentiment of some people who were once, you know, anti-nuclear to the core. So someone like Michael Schellenberger, who was anti-nuclear and was pro wind and solar, he absolutely changed his whole view once he realized that to actually reach these targets, to actually get there, you need nuclear. You need a baseload source that is low carbon. So that was really the main piece that was missing last week. Like, I'm really excited to get onto the supply side, which really shores up the bull case. And once you hear about the gaping supply deficits down the road, if you couple that with demand, it's really one of those investment trades which you'll count your lucky stars that you stumbled across this. I mean, I accidentally stumbled across it back in 2018, and I was mainly looking at the battery metals at the time. I was looking at lithium, cobalt, copper. I was looking at those metals, and yeah, I happened to listen to something on Palisade Radio. They were talking about uranium, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And yeah, I kept hearing about it, and I just sort of took a bit of a deep dive, and before you know it, you realize what you've stumbled across. And it's one of those things you'll never forget once you work out the maths and you just look where things could go down the track with the spot price.
Yeah, and I'm excited to work out the math with you. You've definitely proven that the demand for uranium is going to pick up. So, if the demand goes one way, and we're going to talk about supply and how that will shrink, right? Demand goes up, supply shrinks. It's just there's going to be a squeeze, right? And we talked about last podcast how China is seriously investing in uranium, and they're going to do everything they can to shore up their supply. So it'll be really exciting to hear about what you have to say on the supply.
Yeah, exactly. And there's something else to mention. I don't think it's a story for this decade or this uranium trade. So you've also got SMRs, so small modular reactors. And John Quakes from Twitter, who everyone should follow, by the way, he pointed that out. And it definitely is a story that I think it's probably a story for next decade. But yeah, the promise of small modular reactors, so basically building small reactors in the factory, and you can deploy them rapidly to different locations. So you don't even have to go to a site and build. You can make them in the factory and deploy them. And some of these technologies with the SMRs is, you don't even have to fuel for 20 years. So there's a lot of hope there, Elliot, but I still think they're still working on the technology, and yeah, we won't really see demand, in the next few years. But possibly for the next bull market, it should play out with SMRs.
Great. So the one after, the one in the next 10 years. So that'll just be another thing to look forward to.
Yeah, yeah. So it's something in the background, really. It's an interesting story, but probably, a story for tomorrow. There's something else which is really fascinating, and it could be more of a story for next episode. But in terms of the demand for uranium, you only really have one customer, and that is the nuclear utilities. So you also, uranium is also used in the medical industry, but it's a small fraction of the market. So the main consumer are utilities. They're the people that buy uranium, and then the uranium goes through the fuel cycle for 18 months to 2 years before you actually see it in the nuclear fuel rods. So with uranium, what's really interesting about it is when the price goes up. So if spot goes crazy, if spot goes to 50 to 60, which where it has to go to bring on new production, if it goes to 100, if it goes to 150, what actually happens with the utilities is they actually buy more uranium. And you might be thinking, that doesn't really make sense. Why would utilities buy more uranium at a higher price? Well, probably this is a strange little analogy, but if you think about bananas at the store, so if you have a cyclone or a hurricane that wipes out banana crops, well, the price of bananas will skyrocket. So a normal consumer who has to balance their budget, they will buy less bananas. If you've got money, you're probably still going to put bananas in your trolley. But if the price doubles or triples, you're not going to have as many bananas. But in the instance of a business, their sole business is to sell banana milkshakes. If that's it, it's not orange juice, it's not chocolate milkshakes, it's actually banana milkshakes. What they would do when the price goes up 2 or 3 times and there's a real scarcity of supply, like if they can't get bananas, they can't sell their milkshakes, they actually have to close down their store. They will buy more bananas in that situation. So they call that general principle, it's inelastic demand, but it's actually more than that. When the price goes up, there's a scarcity of supply, they buy more of that product. And that's what happened in the last cycle, Elliot. So during the bull run of 2003, 4, all the way to 2007, the utilities actually bought 150% over their needs. So previously they were buying, 33%. But as the price kind of picked up, we saw these massive volumes of buying from the utilities. And there was a real situation where there was a real possibility that a utility could run out of uranium. And as you could imagine, you can't have that. If you're a utility, you can't just switch these reactors off. You have to keep feeding fuel into the reactors. So your main job is to secure that supply. So security of supply is paramount. So that's something for investors to take into account, that you'll probably find more buying and more volumes the higher the price gets. So that's really exciting. And some people have sort of said, oh, when it gets to 100, if it gets to 100, it gets to 120, who's actually going to buy the stuff? But it's actually the opposite. The behavior of the utilities, it becomes a real scramble for supply.
Yeah, and that's just another reason to be bullish on that demand because, these demand models, I don't know what they're factoring in as the spot price, but if it does spike, which we're thinking it will, and you've kind of proven that demand will spike, then, it'll be an exponential factor probably on the amount of demand that's needed. And we're going to talk about supply, but if it's as scarce as you're going to prove in the next podcast, then supply security is going to be paramount, and every one of these countries is going to be essentially fighting over it.
Yeah, and look, essentially, I mean, you've got the idle producers; they'll come back online first, and so if they get the right price, so if they press the go button at $40, $50, it'll probably take them, 12 to 18 months to come online and ramp up production. So you've got that lag. But even if the idle producers come online, that will still not fill that gaping supply deficit. So that's when you look to new mines coming online, new developments. And if you look through the different companies out there, there's not many companies that are at the start line and are ready to go. So there's only a limited few, which we'll talk about next episode, that actually have all their permits in place, that have their DFS, their definitive feasibility study. So there's not that many in place, but even those companies that are at the start line, Elliot, so everything's in place, they're ready to go, it would still take at least 4 years before that uranium will be in the form of fuel rods in reactors. So let me just explain. Just say the spot price goes to 40 or 50, and a mine does a deal with a utility, and they agree on a price of $50 or $60 per pound. That development mine will then have to get finance, which can take some time. When they eventually start building the mine, that'll take minimum 18 to 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. That's all being well. So if you have delays in weather, if you have anything that goes wrong with the construction, which, if you look back, these things do happen, but all being right, 18 months to 2 years, when they start digging up that uranium ore, it then takes 18 months to 2 years before it goes through the fuel cycle and into fuel rods. So when the price does move, you're not going to see uranium flood the markets because you've got that lag time. You've got that at least 4-year lag time. But in other companies out there, you're talking 5, 6 years before they can come online. And then other companies who don't have the approvals in place and still kind of in the very early stages of development, they're more like 10 years away. So when the crunch hits, it will be an absolute scramble for supply, and you won't see supply meet demand for, I would say, at least 4 years.
That is an absolutely brilliant analysis and a really important thing to know and focus on as an investor, because you don't want to miss that spike, right? So the demand we've talked about, the demand we've proven that will happen over the next few years is going to drive up the price. And when the price drives up, there's going to be, more and more demand for uranium, and that is where the squeeze will come in when it's scarce, right? When the demand overshoots the supply, and it takes months, if not years, for that supply to catch up to the demand. So in that window, the price is probably just going to completely skyrocket, right? Because it'll be a very scarce resource. Maybe once all the production catches up, it'll dip a little bit, but
Exactly, Elliot. In a normal market, if the price goes up, that incentivizes production and the supply catches up with demand. And in many industries, that can happen pretty quickly. But in mining, where it's so capital intensive, and it just takes a very long time to get these projects online, and everything has to go right for a mine to come online. So you've got that 4-year lag time at the very least. That's all going well, and that's the few companies who are actually at the start line ready to go. It'll take them 4 years. So 4 years before that uranium is actually in the reactor. So that's something to think about. I think during that period where you do see a lot of mine approvals and they're trying to catch up and meet demand. I think during that period, who knows what will happen? Who knows what will happen? And I think you'll see more hedge funds and other companies that'll get into the sector and sequester supply. So you've got companies like Yellowcake PLC who bought uranium very low, I think around $18, $19, $20. So they've already their business model is to basically buy pounds and to sit on those pounds and to sell them at a higher price. So last cycle, we saw hedge funds taking pounds off the market during a supply crunch. And basically, utilities and hedge funds were fighting with each other for supply. So it's quite an interesting concept to think about, that when there is a supply crunch, there are companies out there that can put their foot on the throat of utilities and actually take more pounds off the market. So that could really ratchet things up, and that's when you probably could see a massive overshoot during that period.
100%. And that's why I can't wait to hear your take on the supply situation, because what you're saying makes sense in that demand's going to pick up. There will not be enough uranium to feed all the reactors.
Mm-hmm.
And in that situation, it's like it's going to take 4 years to get any more.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like what will the reactors do? They won't. If there just isn't enough to feed the reactors, then I don't know what they'll do. I mean, I guess they'll have some stores, right? They'll have some stock to live on.
Yeah, I mean, every reactor has their own inventory. So I think we talked about China; they've got 7 to 10 years supply. So what'll happen is, I mean, already these reactors have churned through a lot of their inventory, and that they'll have to go back to the market and start contracting very shortly. So I think once you see a few utilities contracting and we find out what the price is, so if they make a deal at $50 or $60 and that's publicized, I think you'll just see just a cascade of contracting happening across the market. And I truly believe there will be a scramble for supply. And a really good analogy is it's kind of like a game of musical chairs. Once the music stops, everyone runs in and tries to grab a chair, and you don't want to be that person who's standing there without a chair. That's not a good situation to be in. So yeah, it's something to think about. And again, no one has a crystal ball, but you just do some research on the last cycle, and that's exactly what happened. And spot went all the way up to about $140 a pound. I think that covers demand. We talked a little bit about supply then, and the behavior of utilities during a bull market, which is pretty important to know. So yeah, the main takeaways of today really are the life extensions, which is a big part of the demand puzzle. And a reactor staying online is just as good as a new build. So if that's the one takeaway investors get, yeah, you'll have a fuller picture of the whole demand dynamic for uranium.
Yeah, well, that's just another piece that we get to add to the framework that you laid out in part 1.
Thanks for your time, Elliot. I really appreciate it, and I really look forward to the supply conversation. It'd be quite explosive once listeners really find out that, yeah, there truly isn't a whole lot of uranium out there.
This discussion is for informational purposes only. Nothing in this discussion should be taken as investment advice. Guests are not compensated for their appearance. Do not base any investment decisions on the information presented.